Okay, keep your Bible open. We're gonna compare the two biblical versions of the flood story. We're gonna talk about that. This flood story started out with the book of Genesis, from Genesis 6 to 9. The two different versions of the flood story that have woven together to form the present unified story in Genesis 6 to 9. The two versions correspond with two originally separated traditions in ancient Israel. The earliest Yahwist, J, that's Yahwist, Yahwist, tradition, and for the later priestly P tradition, the existence of two originally separate versions is evident from a number of consistent variation, doublet, and other tensions of the story, other tensions in the story. These includes the following. Okay? Focus only on human corruption and the destruction of only living things in Genesis 6, 5 to 7. This is J. The Yahwist focus only on human corruption and the destructions of only living things. In Genesis 6, 5 to 7. Versus the priestly tradition, versus a broader focus on the corruption of all flesh, both human and animal, and the destruction of the earth. In Genesis 6, verse 11 through 13, this is what the priestly did. Now, Yahweh, which is J, the reason God chose Noah is that he found favor in God's sight in Genesis 6 to 8. Versus the priestly tradition, versus Noah was a righteous man, priestly tradition, in 6 to 9. Genesis 6, verse 9. The third thing the Yahweh tradition did, the portrayal of the flood is a simple rainstorm in Genesis 7, verse 4. That's a Yahweh tradition. Versus the priestly tradition, who talk about versus the flood as the return of the watery chaos before creation in Genesis 1, verse 2, and Genesis 6, verse 17. That's the priestly tradition that talk about that. On the fourth things, on the Yahweh tradition, the number of animals as 7 pairs of all clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals in Genesis 7, verse 2. That's what the Yahweh tradition concentrate on. Now, the priestly tradition versus 1 pair of all animals of every kind in Genesis 6, verse 19. That's the priestly tradition. Also, and the fifth thing it concentrate on, The Yahweh's, the J tradition, the Yahweh's tradition, deal with the duration of the flood as 40 days and night. We're going to talk about how come it lasts 40 days and night. That 40 days and night will turn to 40 years in the desert as we read along. Okay? The duration of the flood and as 40 days and nights. And in Genesis 7, verse 12, and also 17. Also on chapter 8, verses 6, Genesis. That's the Yahweh tradition. Versus the priestly tradition, which deals with 150 days with the water standing for over a year. And Genesis 7, verse 11, 24. Genesis 8, verse 3 to 5, 13, 15. We deal with the priestly tradition. And finally, for the sixth thing, the divine name of the Lord is J. The divine name of the Lord and J versus God and P. J in Yahweh's tradition and God and priestly tradition. The two biblical version of the flood story may be divided in the following way. We're going to divide the two versions. Yahweh's version and priestly version. Yahweh's version is a J. Priestly version is a P. So put those two separate in a separate note. When I say Yahweh's, you know what I'm talking about. When I say priestly, P version, you know what I'm talking about. Now, Yahweh's version deal with the condition of the world and God's decision. That's in Genesis 6, verse 5 through 8. The priestly version, the condition of the world and God's decision, in the priestly version is chapter 6, 9 to 13. Genesis 6, 9 to 13. The second thing, the introduction concerning the ark and the animals. Yahweh's version, J version, is Genesis 7, 1 through 5. And the P version, which is priestly version, is Genesis 6, 14 to 22. Building the ark as the flood begins. Yahweh's version, J version, is Genesis 7, 7 to 8, 10, 13, 10, 12, 16b, the second part. And the priestly version, boarding the ark as the flood begins, and the priestly version is it with Genesis 7, verse 6, verse 9, 11, 13 through 16a. Remembered, boarding the ark as the flood begins, and the J version is 16b. Now, the flood itself, in the Yahweh's version, it discussed the flood itself in chapter 7, verse 17, and also 22 to 23. And the priestly version, which is P, mark the two things separate, put a line in between so you know what you're talking about. Is Genesis 7, verse 18 to 21, and also 24. The end of the flood. The end of the flood. Mark it down. In Yahweh's version, which is the J, it talk about, goes into Genesis 8.2b to 3a. The end of Genesis 8.2 and 3a, the first part of Genesis. Also, Genesis, it goes into 8, 6 to 12, and also 13b. 8.2b to 3a, the first part, then goes to then goes to verse 6 to 12 and 13b. Now, that's the Yahweh's version J. The priestly version is chapter 8, verse 1 to 2a, the first part of A. The first part of 2, verse 1 to 2a. Then it goes on to the verse 3b to verse 5. Then it continue on to 13a and 14 to 19. That's the priestly version. God's promise in the Yahweh's version, the J version, is chapter 8, verse 20 to 22. God's promise in the priestly version is chapter 9, verse 1 to 7. The covenant of the rainbow. The covenant of the rainbow. He didn't have one under Yahweh's version in the J, but he had one on the priestly version, which is chapter 9, verse 8 to 17. The sons of Noah. Now talk about the sons of Noah on Yahweh's version, the J version, chapter 9, verse 18 to 27. But the priestly version didn't talk about the son of Noah. The age of Noah and his death. The Yahweh's version, the J version, didn't talk about that. But on the priestly version, it continues to chapter 9, verse 28 to 29. So, this is the true biblical version of the flood story. Concentrate, put a line into it, put the Yahweh's version, that's YAHWIST version, and the priestly, PRIESTLY version, and put a P next to that. It will help you to understand as you read along the Bible when you talk about the Yahweh's version and the priestly version. Help you understand it a little bit more, help you grasp it a little bit more, so you could understand everything as you read along the Bible.